Welcome back to the Red Dice Diaries, and in this RPG review I'm going to be looking at the Swords and Wizardry Complete Rules by Frog God Games. It's a 140 page hardback book with a black and white interior. The PDF is free. The hardback book, like I've got here, costs $34.99 US, which is just over £20 in English money, and I'll put a link to their website down below where it can be ordered from. Now, Swords and Wizardry is an OSR product creating a version of D&D using the Wizards of the Coast open game license that was introduced with 3rd edition D&D, if I remember correctly. There are various different versions of Swords and Wizardry available. My Google foo led me to a post from the Hooded Ronan on the rpg.net forum, which describes the different versions as follows. There is Swords and Wizardry Core, which is a retro clone of the original D&D brown-white box and rules from the first supplement. There is the Swords and Wizardry White Box, which is a retro clone of just the original D&D brown or white box. And there is Swords and Wizardry Complete, which is what I'm reviewing here, which is a retro clone of the entire original D&D line all in one book. Now, I'm reviewing the Complete Edition, like I say, since I'd rather have all the rules in one book. Now, there may be some differences between the different versions, but I'm not likely to buy the other editions having this one. But don't you own a copy of like almost every edition of D&D going? And not to mention you own an edition of almost every Star Wars game that's ever been released. No. Seriously though, Swords and Wizardry wears its heart on its sleeve, and it sets out to create a no-nonsense clone of the original D&D. The text is organised into columns and the layout is nice and clean, with a smattering of black and white art in various styles throughout the book. The first chapter is titled Creating a Character. Now, nothing will come as a surprise here to anyone who's played D&D. You roll your attributes, which govern some other abilities such as forcing doors open and your chances of surviving being raised from the dead. Anyone who remembers original D&D will probably get a hit of nostalgia here, although people unused to the older game may find some of the abilities a little arbitrary and vague compared to some games' attempts to cover every eventuality. This is quite deliberate and is addressed in the introduction. The game is based around a strong central mechanic, and it trusts you to sort out the rest yourself. As someone who is a fan of games like Dungeon World, a game that applied modern gaming sensibilities to a similar philosophy, I'm a big supporter of this type of thinking. The game moves on to present us with rules for the following classes: Assassin, Cleric, Druids, Fighters, Magic Users, Monks, Paladins, Rangers and Thieves, all of which seem to have levels up to 21, except for the Assassin that seems to pretty much stop at level 14. I'm not really sure why that is. If you know, feel free to post your answers in the comments box down below. Each of the classes lists their abilities, from the Thief's ability to climb walls and lurk in the shadows, right up to the Cleric's power to repel the dead. Next, the player chooses a character race from the choice of dwarves, elves, half-elves, halflings and humans. And although the races don't receive stat alterations as they do in some games, they do receive racial abilities, from the dwarves' ability to resist magic and spot stoneworked traps to the elves' dark vision and resistance to paralysis. Throughout the book there are numerous grey box outs that either provide optional rules or point out why certain design decisions were made by the creators of Swords and Wizardry. I like this because it's nice to see why a game turned out as it did. It would also be handy to know the logic behind these decisions for when you have to make house rules or alterations, something that is almost certain to happen given the light touch of the game rules in Swords and Wizardry, and something that is actively encouraged by the authors. Players also choose an alignment, although unlike modern D&D, there is a choice of only 3, and these are Law, someone who is active on behalf of civilization and goodness; Chaos, someone who has fallen into demonic beliefs or evil ways; and Neutral, anyone who lies between the polar opposites of Law and Chaos. This chapter is rounded off with a fairly generic equipment list and some weapon and armour stats. It's not particularly exciting, but then I wouldn't expect it to be, since it's a list of equipment. It says what it needs to say with a minimum of fuss, and it takes up only a small amount of space in the book. We also have some notes about descending and ascending armour class. The original D&D using the off-maligned THACO, or to hit armour class 0 system, where lower armour classes were better, and this is the default system that Swords and Wizardry uses. However, the system was somewhat counterintuitive, so stats are also provided for people who wish to use the more familiar ascending system, where higher armour classes are better. And I'm very pleased that the game gives people the option to make that choice, and has both the choices firmly bedded into the system. The next section is called How to Play, and in addition to giving some small snippets of general advice on how to play the game, it also covers gaining XP by the normal original D&D methods of killing monsters and gaining treasure, which may seem a little old-fashioned, but it is very much in character with the game that Swords and Wizardry is trying to emulate. We move on to the combat chapter, which covers the order of a standard combat and what actions can be taken. However, it also provides 3 optional different methods of determining a combat sequence, adapted from different original D&D source books. Whilst I'm not really a big rules person, I'm always a fan of giving people more options, and these box outs provide an interesting look at the way the original game changed over time. The chapter also covers the cleric's ability to turn or ward off undead. Essentially, the player rolls 2d10 and looks at the challenge level of the undead they're attempting to turn on the chart. This tells them whether they have been repelled or sometimes even destroyed outright, depending on the strength of the undead and the power of the cleric. Taking damage, healing and morale are covered at the end of the chapter, and it rounds off with a prose example of how a typical session might run. This will be useful for anyone not familiar with RPGs, and it also helps to paint a picture of how the authors think a typical Swords and Wizardry session should go. Next we move on to high level adventuring, and I found this chapter really interesting. I've played in so few D&D style games where we've even got anywhere near high level that the abilities you might acquire at such levels are a little bit of a mystery to me, although reading supplements leads me to believe that in more modern D&D it's a simple power escalation. I was quite surprised then to find that this chapter focused far more on characters taking a place in a campaign world, perhaps building a stronghold or taking on additional followers. I thought this was very interesting, and I like the idea of high-level PCs becoming movers and shakers in a campaign world because they have influence and they've set down roots, far more than the idea that they can do so simply because they have more powers and oodles of magic items. Speaking of magic, that's the next chapter. Now, as a D&D retro clone, it will come as no surprise that the game uses the fire and forget or Vancian system of magic that, whether you love it or hate it, has become closely associated with D&D over the years. For those not familiar with it, a magic user studies their spellbook and stores a number of spells in their head. Once these are used, they are gone until the caster can rest and study his books again. The chapter provides a spell list for the magic user, druid and cleric classes, and most of these spells will be familiar to anyone who's played D&D or style games before. The next section of the book is for the referee, and it talks briefly about various topics that will be useful for running a campaign, and it also lays out some guidelines for the GM. These are 1. The rules are just guidelines, 2. There is not a rule for everything, and 3. When in doubt, make a ruling. These are, in my opinion, good things for the GM of any game to keep in mind, and something that even more modern games tended to have started to lean towards again, coming full circle. We move on to the designing an adventure chapter, and this section splits the types of adventure firmly into that of dungeon adventures and wilderness adventuring. These sections seem a little bit light to me, being mainly a collection of encounter tables for various levels of the dungeon or different terrains when in the wilderness. However, I do think this is very in character with the game that Swords and Wizardry is emulating, so I can't really complain too much. And there are some interesting asides in the chapter, such as the potential usefulness of a dungeon cross-section and how to model the potential for getting lost in the wilderness. We then move on to a discussion of various special combat circumstances, such as mass and siege combat, just to name two. This provides a simple unit-based system for adjudicating mass combat and talks about the difficulties of portraying siege warfare in any simple form, choosing, wisely in my opinion, to focus on the final storming of the castle rather than portraying the entire siege, allowing the authors to simplify the rules down somewhat. Rules for aerial and naval combat follow, and these do add a little more complexity, but since they're only be used under fairly rare circumstances in a typical game, and normally is one of the main focuses of a session, I don't think this is too much of a problem. Next is the bestiary chapter. For those of us used to modern games with their huge monster entries and vast arrays of special abilities, the relatively small stat blocks for each monster, combined with minimal ecology information and special abilities that require a fair amount of gem interpretation, might come as a little bit of a surprise. However, when you read the chapter, it actually contains a lot of different creatures, and most of them are so familiar to the average role player that you don't really need scads of information about them. Those creatures that do require a little bit more detailed information, such as some of the more exotic demons and dragons, receive a few more paragraphs of text. The last chapter of the book is pretty much a selection of random treasure tables and some advice on using them to create monster hordes, and we round off with a nice, clearly designed blank character sheets, as well as a little bit of information on a few interesting things like creating intelligent swords and weapons. So in conclusion, overall, I really enjoyed reading this book. It brought back a lot of nostalgia for me about the older versions of D&D that I used to own, when role-playing was a night of venturing through dank underground lairs filled with monsters, traps and treasure. The game does a great job of using the open game license to capture that old school D&D feel, and I've thoroughly enjoyed it. Now, is it going to make me turn entirely away from the more narrative games that are my mainstay? No, of course not. However, the book does make me think that there is still a small 10 by 10 space in my heart, probably guarded by a solitary orc, for some old school dungeon crawling and D&D fun. If you're looking to recapture the nostalgia of D&D's early days, or you're looking for a simple D&D game to start with, then Swords and Wizardry might very well be right up your street. So, I hope if you've enjoyed this video, you'll consider clicking on the red dice up there to subscribe to my channel. If you enjoyed this video, hit it with a thumbs up. If you didn't, give it a thumbs down. If you have anything you want to say about it, please put it in the comments section down below. I enjoy reading what you write. And until I see you next time, take care and happy gaming.